What would you do if inheriting your dream meant living your worst nightmare? Clara Whitmore thought escaping to Montana would bury her past forever. But when the rugged rancher next door turns out to be connected to the tragedy that destroyed her family, she must choose between the truth that could save her land and the lies that protect her heart. In 1885 Montana, some secrets are worth dying for, others are worth living for. This is a story about a woman who discovered that sometimes the only way to claim your future is to face the fires of your past. If you love stories of resilience, forbidden love, and second chances, smash that like button and subscribe for more epic tales of the American West. When secrets bloom in Montana, a woman's fight for love and land in the Wild West. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in Boston, delivered by a boy who waited expectantly for a tip Clara Whitmore couldn't afford to give. Clara Whitmore, stop. Uncle Theodore deceased. Stop ranch yours under conditions. Stop must reside minimum 2 years. Stop lawyer advises immediate travel. Stop contact Morrison Law Billings. Montana, stop. Clara read the words 3 times before they made sense. Uncle Theodore. She hadn't seen him since she was 12 when he'd visited Ohio just before her world fell apart. Now he was dead and somehow she owned property in Montana. Standing in her cramped Boston boarding house room, Clara felt the walls closing in. 3 months since the dress shop had closed. 2 months since her savings had run out. 1 month since she'd started rationing meals to make her last dollar stretch. The journey west was a blur of train cars and transfer stations, each mile carrying her farther from everything familiar. Clara pressed her face to the window as the landscape changed from green hills to endless plains to mountains that looked like God's own cathedral walls. She tried not to think about the last time she'd seen country like this. Tried not to remember the smell of smoke or the sound of her father screaming her sister's name as flames consumed everything they'd built. Montana territory stretched before her like a canvas painted in impossible colors. Clara had forgotten how big the sky could be, how small it could make a person feel. The train wheezed to a stop in Billings, and Clara gathered her few possessions with hands that trembled slightly. The town was bigger than she'd expected, but still felt temporary, like everything might pack up and move on tomorrow if the mood struck. Clara found lodging at a small hotel and spent her first night staring at the ceiling, wondering what she'd gotten herself into. Morrison Law occupied a modest office on Main Street. Clara arrived precisely at 9, her one decent dress pressed as well as she could manage in a hotel room. Miss Whitmore. The secretary was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes. Mr. Morrison is expecting you. The lawyer was younger than Clara had anticipated, perhaps 35, with the kind of weathered look that spoke of hard country and honest work. He rose as she entered, extending a hand. Caleb Morrison, I'm sorry for your loss. Clara shook his hand, noting the calluses that seemed unusual for a lawyer. Thank you. Though I should be honest, Mr. Morrison, I barely knew my uncle. Please sit. Caleb gestured to a chair that faced his desk. Your Uncle Theodore was a complex man. He came to Montana 15 years ago with big dreams and bigger debts. Built something real out there, but he was always fighting ghosts. Clara's chest tightened. Fighting ghosts. She knew something about that. The ranch comprises 800 acres in the Gallatin Valley. Caleb continued consulting papers on his desk. Current livestock includes approximately 60 head of cattle, 12 horses, and miscellaneous fowl. The property includes a main house, barn, bunkhouse, and various outbuildings. It sounds substantial. It is, but there's the matter of the conditions. Caleb leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. Your uncle specified that you must reside on and actively manage the property for a minimum of 2 years. If you fail to meet these requirements, the property reverts to the territorial government. Clara absorbed this information. 2 years in Montana. 2 years learning to run a ranch she knew nothing about. Except that wasn't entirely true, was it? Mr. Morrison, I should tell you that I have no experience with ranching. I'm a seamstress by trade. Something flickered in Caleb's expression. Most people who inherit property out here don't have experience. It's a hard life, Miss Whitmore. Harder than anything you've known in the city. Your uncle wanted to make sure whoever inherited his land would commit to it properly. And if I can't manage it, if I fail, then you lose everything. He said it simply, without judgment. But your uncle also left resources to help you succeed. There's a foreman named Jack Sullivan who's worked the place for 5 years, knows the land, and the livestock. If you're willing to learn, he's willing to teach. Clara nodded slowly. When can I see the property? Tomorrow if you'd like. It's about an hour's ride from town. Caleb paused, his gaze sharpening. Miss Whitmore, can I ask why you've come west? Most women in your position would sell immediately, even with the conditions attached. The question hit closer to home than Clara could afford to let show, because she was running, because staying in Boston meant slow starvation or worse, because sometimes a person needed to disappear so completely that even they weren't sure who they used to be. I need a fresh start, Mr. Morrison. Boston holds nothing for me anymore. Something in her voice must have convinced him not to push further. Fair enough. I'll take you out to the property tomorrow morning. 8 o'clock sharp. That evening, Clara sat in the hotel dining room, picking at a meal she'd paid too much for and trying to imagine herself as a rancher. The few other guests ignored her, absorbed in conversations about cattle prices and weather patterns and the railroad's impact on shipping costs. She caught fragments of their discussions, words that stirred memories she'd been trying to suppress for 7 years. Breeding stock, water rights, predator losses, the vocabulary of a life she'd sworn never to live again. But maybe she didn't have a choice. Maybe she'd never had a choice. Clara returned to her room and lay awake listening to the town settle into nighttime quiet. Tomorrow she would see the property that might be her salvation or her destruction. Tomorrow she would begin pretending to be someone she'd never been while trying to forget everything about who she used to be. Sleep came fitfully broken by dreams of fire and a sister's voice calling her name across impossible distances. Caleb arrived at the hotel precisely at 8, riding a bay gelding and leading a gentle-looking mare. He was dressed for work rather than town-worn leather and practical cotton that spoke of a man more comfortable outside than behind a desk. You ride? He asked as Clara approached. A little, though. It was a lie by omission. She'd grown up on horseback, racing her sister across Ohio pastures until the world ended in smoke and flame. I may need some help. Caleb dismounted and handed her the mare's reins. This is Daisy. She's calm enough for a beginner. Just sit deep, keep your heels down, and let her do most of the work. Clara accepted his assistance, mounting, forcing herself to seem awkward and uncertain. Daisy stood patiently as Clara found her seat and gathered the reins with hands that remembered exactly how this should feel. They rode east from Billings into country that took Clara's breath away. The Gallatin Valley spread before them like a green ocean bounded by mountains that seemed close enough to touch, but distant as heaven. Cattle dotted the landscape, moving slowly across grassland that stretched to the horizon. Beautiful country, Clara said, and meant it. It is. Also dangerous. Weather can turn without warning, predators are constant threats, and the nearest neighbor might be hours away when trouble hits. Caleb gestured toward a creek running clear and fast beside their trail. But if you can handle the challenges, there's no place like it. They rode in comfortable silence for the better part of an hour. Clara found herself relaxing in the saddle despite her supposed inexperience, muscle memory asserting itself regardless of her intentions to remain convincingly helpless. You're a natural, Caleb observed. Most city folks take weeks to find their seat. Clara forced herself to wobble slightly. I'm just trying not to fall off. The ranch appeared gradually as they crested a low hill. Clara's first impression was of solid functionality rather than beauty. Log buildings arranged around a central yard, corrals and pastures spreading outward, everything built to last rather than impress. There it is, Caleb said. The Whitmore place. Clara studied the property with eyes trained from childhood to assess ranch operations. Good water access from the creek. Adequate shelter for livestock. Buildings properly positioned for efficiency and wind protection. Her uncle had known what he was doing. A man emerged from the barn as they approached. Tall and weathered, perhaps 50 years old, with the easy confidence Clara associated with people who worked with their hands for a living. Jack Sullivan, Caleb said by way of introduction. Jack, this is Clara Whitmore, Theodore's niece. Jack touched his hat brim. Miss Whitmore, sorry for your loss. Theodore was a good man and a fair boss. Thank you. Clara dismounted with Caleb's assistance, grateful for the excuse to keep her competence hidden. I understand you've been managing the ranch. Day-to-day operations, yes, ma'am. Your uncle handled the business side, but I know the land and the livestock. Jack gestured toward the buildings. Would you like to see the house first, or should we start with the operations? The house, please. Clara followed Caleb and Jack to the main building, her boots crunching on packed earth. The porch was solid underfoot, built to support heavy use rather than impress visitors. Inside the house was larger than she'd expected. A main room with stone fireplace dominated the center with doorways leading to what appeared to be kitchen bedrooms and storage areas. Furniture was minimal, but well made, everything chosen for function over decoration. Your uncle lived simply, Caleb observed, but he built to last. Clara walked through the room slowly, trying to imagine herself living here. The kitchen was well appointed with a good stove and adequate storage. The bedroom held a single bed with quilts that looked handmade. Everything was clean, but clearly belonged to a man who'd lived alone for many years. It's more than I expected, Clara said honestly. In Boston, I had one room barely large enough for a bed and washstand. They spent the morning touring the property. Jack showed Clara the barn with its stalls for horses and storage for hay and equipment, the corrals where cattle could be held for sorting or medical treatment, the bunkhouse where seasonal help stayed during busy times. We're heading into summer, Jack explained. Good time for someone new to learn. Cattle are on open range, getting fat on gratis. Come fall, we'll need to round them up, sort them, decide what goes to market and what stays for breeding. That's when the real work starts. Clara nodded, absorbing information she already knew, but needed to pretend to learn. How many people does that take? Depends on how many cattle we're working. This year probably need 4 or 5 hands for roundup. Your uncle usually hired help from town, paid them by the chaw rather than keeping a full crew year-round. They returned to the house for lunch that Jack prepared with practiced efficiency. Simple food but well cooked, and Clara found herself genuinely hungry for the first time in months. So what do you think? Caleb asked as they finished eating. Are you prepared to commit 2 years to this life? Clara looked around the main room at furniture her uncle had chosen at windows that framed views of mountains and grassland. She thought about her tiny Boston room, about the dwindling prospects for employment, about the slow slide toward poverty and desperation that awaited her back east. She also thought about the last time she lived on a ranch, about fire and screaming and the sound of her sister Rose calling for help that never came. I'd like to try, Clara said quietly, but I'm going to need help, a lot of help. Jack and Caleb exchanged glances. Learning to run a ranch isn't like learning needlework, Jack said carefully. It's dangerous work, physical work. You make the wrong decision and people can get hurt. Then teach me not to make wrong decisions. Something in her voice must have convinced them she was serious. Jack leaned back in his chair, studying her with weathered eyes. All right, Miss Whitmore. If you're determined to try this, we'll help you learn. But understand what you're committing to. Ranching isn't a job you do from 9 to 5. It's a way of life. Animals need tending, regardless of weather or how you're feeling. Equipment breaks at the worst possible times. Markets fluctuate beyond your control. Every season brings challenges that could destroy everything you are working to build. Clara met his gaze directly. I understand the risks. Do you, Caleb's voice was skeptical, because I've seen people come west with romantic notions about frontier life. Most of them don't last 6 months. I'm not most people, Mr. Morrison. He studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. No, I don't think you are. There's something in your eyes, like you've already seen more than most city women would. Clara's heart jumped. She couldn't afford to be too transparent, couldn't let them see too much of who she really was. I've had my share of hardships, she said carefully. That's why I need this to work. They spent the afternoon going over the ranch's current status. 62 head of cattle currently grazing summer range, 12 horses in various stages of training and use, adequate hay stored for winter feeding. Financial records that showed the operation was modestly profitable but required constant attention to remain viable. Your uncle left detailed notes about everything, Caleb said, showing Clara ledger books filled with cramped handwriting. Weather patterns, breeding decisions, market timing. He was meticulous about documentation. Clara studied the pages, recognizing the obsessive attention to detail that characterized successful ranchers. Her father had kept similar records until the fire consumed everything. This is overwhelming, she said, which was partly true, not because she didn't understand it, but because she understood it too well. because it reminded her of everything she'd lost and sworn never to risk again. Start small, Jack suggested. Learn to handle the horses first, then we'll introduce you to cattle work. By the time fall roundup comes, you should be competent enough to help rather than just observe. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Caleb prepared to return to town. I'll check on you in a week or so, he said as he saddled his horse. If you need anything urgent, send Jack to town with a message. Clara stood in the ranch yard watching him ride away, dust rising from his horse's hooves until he disappeared beyond the first hill. The vastness of what she'd committed to settled over her like a weight. You all right, miss? Jack's voice was kind but assessing. Just trying to absorb everything. Clara turned to face him. This is so different from anything I've known. City life and ranch life don't have much in common, Jack agreed. But you seem like a determined woman. That counts for a lot out here. They spent the evening on the porch as sunset painted the mountains impossible shades of pink and gold. Jack explained seasonal rhythms, told stories about her uncle, outlined the challenges that would define Clara's next 2 years. Theodore was a good man, Jack said as stars began emerging in the darkening sky. But he was running from something, never said what, but a man doesn't isolate himself like he did without reasons. Hope whatever drove you west isn't the kind of thing that'll eat at you the same way. Clara's chest tightened. Everyone has things they'd rather forget. True enough, just remember that forgetting and healing aren't the same thing. Montana's a good place for fresh starts, but only if you're willing to do the work of actually starting fresh. That night, Clara lay in her uncle's bed, listening to sounds she hadn't heard in 7 years. Wind through grass, cattle lowing in distant pastures, the creak of wood adjusting to temperature changes, night sounds of a working ranch. She tried not to remember the last time she'd fallen asleep to these sounds. Tried not to think about Rose laughing in the next room, or their father checking locks one final time before retiring. Tried not to remember how safe she'd felt before learning that safety was an illusion that could vanish in smoke and flame. Clara Whitmore had come to Montana to escape her past, but as she drifted towards sleep in a ranch house 800 acres from the nearest neighbor, she realized she might have stepped directly back into everything she'd been running from. Tomorrow would bring her first real day as a rancher. Tomorrow she would begin learning skills she already possessed while hiding knowledge that could save her or destroy her, depending on who discovered it. Tomorrow the real work would begin. But tonight, for the first time since fleeing Ohio 7 years ago, Clara fell asleep feeling like she might finally have found a place where she could stop running, even if that place terrified her more than anything she'd left behind. The next morning brought her first lesson in why Jack Sullivan had worked for her uncle for 5 years. He appeared at the house before dawn with coffee already brewed and breakfast materials in hand. Ranch work starts early, he said as Clara stumbled into the kitchen still half asleep. Animals don't care if you're tired or want to sleep in. Clara forced herself to fumble with the stove, pretending incompetence, while Jack demonstrated the morning routine. In reality, she could have prepared this meal with her eyes closed, could have managed every aspect of breakfast preparation without instruction. But Clara Whitmore, the seamstress, needed to learn everything from scratch. First rule of ranching, Jack said, as they ate eggs and bacon that tasted better than anything Clara had consumed in months. Eat when you can because you never know when the next meal is coming. After breakfast, Jack led her to the barn where the horses waited for morning feeding. Clara approached the stalls with carefully manufactured hesitation as if she'd never been near such large animals. This is Dusty, Jack said, indicating a brown gelding with intelligent eyes. He was your uncle's riding horse. Calm disposition, knows his job good for someone learning to handle livestock. Clara let Jack show her how to approach safely, how to read the horse's mood, how to lead him from the stall with confidence but not aggression. Everything he taught her was correct, exactly what her father had taught her and Rose when they were children. The familiarity was both comforting and painful. Clara found herself remembering Rose's laughter as they raced across Ohio pastures, their father's patient corrections when they made mistakes, their mother's pride when they successfully completed difficult tasks. You're doing well, Jack observed, as Clara successfully bridled Dusty with minimal assistance. Most city folks are scared of horses at first. They're larger than I expected, Clara said, which wasn't a lie, but they seem gentle. Horses are prey animals. They respond to confidence and fear equally. If you're calm and certain they'll trust you, If you're nervous or hesitant, they'll sense it and act accordingly. Jack spent the morning teaching Clara basic horse handling, how to curry and brush properly, how to check hooves for stones or damage, how to recognize signs of illness or injury. Clara absorbed the instruction while fighting memories of doing these exact tasks alongside her sister, their young voices chattering about everything and nothing while their hands worked with practiced efficiency. You learned fast, Jack said, as Clara successfully completed each task. Faster than I expected for someone with no experience. Clara's heart jumped. She needed to be more careful, needed to remember that Clara Whitmore, the seamstress, would struggle with things that came naturally to Clara Whitmore, who'd grown up on a ranch. Maybe I'm better with my hands than I thought, she said carefully. Sewing requires precise movements. Perhaps that translates to other work. Jack seemed to accept this explanation. They spent the afternoon on fence repairs, Jack showing Clara how to identify weak spots, how to replace broken rails, how to maintain the boundaries that kept cattle where they belonged. The work was hard, but familiar. Clara's muscles remembered the rhythm of physical labor, the satisfaction of seeing immediate results from honest effort. Her hands blistered despite years of needlework, but the pain felt cleaner than anything she'd experienced in Boston. As they worked, Jack talked about the ranch's history, about her uncle's struggles and successes, about the challenges facing any operation this size. Theodore bought this place from a man who'd given up after 3 bad winters, Jack explained as they reset a fence post that had worked loose. Took Theodore 5 years to get it profitable, another 5 to make it genuinely successful. Building something out here requires patience and stubbornness in equal measure. What made him successful where the previous owner failed? Attention to detail, willingness to learn from people who knew better. And luck, though, Theodore would never admit luck played a role. Jack paused in his work, considering his words. Your uncle was smart enough to listen to advice and stubborn enough to stick with difficult decisions. Those are the traits that matter most in ranching. They worked until sunset, completing repairs that would have taken Clara half as long if she'd been working at full capacity. But maintaining her pretense of inexperience was more important than efficiency, at least until she decided how much truth she could safely reveal. That evening, Jack prepared dinner while Clara attempted to process everything she'd learned. Not the technical aspects of ranch work, which came back to her like a half-forgotten song, but the emotional complexity of being surrounded by sights and sounds that brought back memories she'd spent 7 years trying to suppress. You seem thoughtful tonight, Jack observed as they ate at the kitchen table. Something troubling you. Clara chose her words carefully. It's just so different from city life. The silence, the space, the way every day feels so consequential. City life's all about crowds and noise and rushing around. Ranch life is about observation and patience and understanding that some things can't be hurried. Jack studied her face in the lamplight. It takes time to adjust, but most people find the rhythm suits them once they stop fighting it. Did my uncle find it suited him? Jack was quiet for a moment, his expression growing distant. For a while, yes, Theodore loved this land, loved building something from nothing. But he carried sadness that never seemed to ease. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at the mountains like he was looking for someone who never came home. Clara's throat tightened. She knew something about looking for people who never came home. Did he ever talk about what made him so? Not directly, but he'd get letters sometimes that would send him into dark moods for days. And he had a photograph he'd look at when he thought no one was watching. Young woman with dark hair, pretty face. Always wondered if she was someone he'd lost. Clara excused herself early that evening, claiming exhaustion from the day's work. In reality, she needed time alone to process the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her careful composure. Standing on the porch in the darkness, Clara looked up at stars so brilliant they seemed close enough to touch. The same stars that had shone over Ohio 7 years ago. The same stars Rose had pointed out from their bedroom window, making up stories about constellation adventures they'd never lived to share. Clara had come to Montana to escape her past, but every moment on this ranch brought memories closer to the surface. The familiar rhythms of ranch work, the smell of hay and leather and animals, the vast sky that made human troubles seem both insignificant and overwhelming. Maybe Jack was right about the difference between forgetting and healing. Maybe Clara had spent 7 years burying trauma instead of processing it. Maybe facing her past was the only way to claim any kind of future. But first she had to survive 2 years of pretending to be someone she wasn't while learning to be someone she used to be. And she had to do it without letting anyone discover that Clara Whitmore, the seamstress, was really Clara Whitmore, the rancher's daughter, who'd watched her world burn and never forgiven herself for surviving when Rose hadn't. The first week passed in a routine that felt both foreign and familiar. Jack proved to be a patient teacher, breaking down complex tasks into manageable steps and allowing Clara time to master each component. Clara played her role carefully, showing the right amount of struggle with tasks that should have been automatic while demonstrating the determination that would justify her rapid progress. By week's end, she could saddle and ride Dusty with reasonable competence. She could perform basic horse care without supervision. She could identify common problems with fencing and equipment. To Jack's eyes, she was an eager student, making impressive progress. In reality, Clara was a skilled rancher, slowly allowing her true capabilities to show. Friday evening brought a visitor. Clara was helping Jack with evening chores when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both look up. A rider emerged from the twilight, moving at an easy pace that suggested friendly intent rather than emergency. "That'll be Caleb," Jack said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Said he'd check in after your first week." Clara's heart did something complicated as Caleb Morrison rode into the ranch yard. In town, dressed professionally, he'd seemed like any other businessman. Here, mounted on a horse with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle, he looked like what he probably was beneath the lawyer facade, a man who understood hard country and harder choices. "Miss Whitmore, Jack." Caleb dismounted with fluid efficiency, his gaze taking in Clara's work-stained clothes and sun-darkened skin. "How's the education proceeding?" "She's a quick study," Jack said, pride evident in his voice. "Faster than I expected for someone with no experience. Give her another month and she'll be competent with most basic tasks." "Is that so?" Caleb's eyes met Clara's, something unreadable in his expression. "And what do you think, Miss Whitmore? Are you finding ranch life suits you?" Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks under his direct gaze. There was something about the way he looked at her, like he was seeing more than she intended to show. "It's challenging," she said honestly, "but also satisfying in ways I didn't expect. There's something about working with your hands, seeing immediate results from your effort. Different from sewing. Very different. With sewing, you create something beautiful, but essentially decorative. Here, everything serves a purpose. Everything matters." Caleb nodded slowly. "That's the difference between city work and ranch work. Out here, mistakes have consequences that go beyond inconvenience." Jack invited Caleb to stay for dinner, and Clara found herself cooking for three while the men discussed cattle prices and weather patterns and the dozen practical concerns that defined ranch operations. She listened while she worked, noting how Caleb's knowledge seemed to extend well beyond legal matters into the technical aspects of ranching itself. "You seem to know a lot about cattle management for a lawyer," Clara observed as they ate. "I grew up on a ranch about 20 miles south of here," Caleb explained. "Studied law back east, but I came home after my father died to help my mother manage the family property. Law practice is my profession, but ranching is in my blood. So you understand what I'm trying to learn. I understand how difficult it is and how dangerous it can be for someone unprepared." His gaze sharpened. "Jack says you're learning fast. Almost too fast for someone with no background in this kind of work." Clara's pulse quickened. Was he suspicious? Had she revealed too much competence too quickly? "Maybe I have more natural aptitude than I realized," she said carefully. "Or maybe desperation is a good teacher." "Maybe." But Caleb's tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. After dinner, Jack excused himself to check on the horses, leaving Clara and Caleb alone at the kitchen table. Clara busied herself clearing dishes, acutely aware of his presence in the small space. "Clara." His use of her first name made her look up from the basin where she was washing plates. "Can I ask you something personal?" Her hands stilled in the soapy water. "Of course. What happened to you back east? What drove you west?" The question she'd been dreading. Clara kept her hands busy with the dishes, using the activity to hide her expression, while she considered how much truth she could afford to reveal. "Nothing dramatic," she lied. "Just Circumstances that made staying impossible and leaving necessary. Circumstances like poverty, like scandal, like running from something that might follow you. Clara turned to face him, fully water dripping from her hands. Why are you asking? Because I've seen people come west running from their past before. Some are running from things that deserve to be left behind. Others are running from things that need to be faced. His expression was serious concern rather than judgmental. I want to make sure you're not putting yourself in danger by being out here alone. I'm not alone. Jack is here. Jack won't be here forever. He's been talking about moving on, maybe starting his own place. If that happens, you'll need to manage this ranch entirely on your own or hire help you might not be able to afford. The possibility of losing Jack's support sent anxiety through Clara's chest. She'd been counting on having time to slowly reveal her competence to transition gradually from student to capable rancher. Without Jack, that timeline would collapse. I'll cross that bridge when I come to it, she said, aiming for confidence she didn't feel. Will you? Caleb stood, moving closer to where she stood by the basin. Because sometimes bridges burn before you reach them. Sometimes you need to prepare for challenges you hope won't come. He was standing close enough now that Clara could smell leather and sage and something essentially masculine that made her pulse quicken. When had she become so aware of him as a man rather than just a lawyer helping with her uncle's estate? What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that if Jack does decide to move on, you might benefit from additional help. Someone with ranch experience who could provide guidance until you're fully competent. Someone like you. Someone like me. The offer was reasonable, practical, exactly what Clara would need if she found herself truly alone on 800 acres with 60 head of cattle and no idea how to manage them. It was also dangerous. Caleb Morrison was too observant, too perceptive. Spending more time with him would increase the risk of discovery of someone recognizing that Clara Whitmore, the seamstress, knew far too much about ranching for someone supposedly learning it all from scratch. But it might also be necessary. And if Clara was being honest, the prospect of working alongside Caleb Morrison wasn't entirely unwelcome. That's very generous, she said carefully, but I couldn't afford to pay you what such help would be worth. Who said anything about payment? Neighbors help each other out here. That's how communities survive in a hard country. We're neighbors. My family's ranch borders your eastern property line. Has for 15 years. He smiled, and Clara realized it was the first time she'd seen his face completely relaxed. Your uncle and I had our differences over water rights and fence maintenance, but we worked them out like reasonable people. Clara dried her hands on a kitchen towel, using the motion to create some distance between them. Being close to Caleb Morrison affected her concentration in ways that could prove dangerous. I appreciate the offer. If circumstances change, I'll remember it. Good. Caleb moved toward the door, then paused. Clara, there's something I want you to know. Montana territory can be dangerous for a woman alone. Wild animals, bad weather, men with questionable intentions. If you ever feel unsafe, if you need help for any reason, don't hesitate to send for me. Thank you. That's very kind. It's practical. Lost settlers don't make good neighbors. But his tone was gentle, suggesting kindness rather than mere pragmatism. After Caleb left, Clara stood on the porch watching dust settle from his horse's departure. The conversation had raised questions she wasn't prepared to answer and offered solutions that might prove more dangerous than the problems they solved. Jack emerged from the barn, his chores completed for the evening. Caleb's a good man, he said, joining Clara on the porch. His father was one of the most respected ranchers in the valley. Caleb's got the same reputation for fairness and honesty. He offered to help if you decide to leave. Jack was quiet for a moment. I've been meaning to talk to you about that. I've had an offer to manage a place down in Wyoming. Better pay closer to my sister who's getting on in years. I wasn't planning to leave until you were more established, but Clara's heart sank. But the offer won't wait indefinitely. No, they want an answer within the month. Then you should take it. Clara forced her voice to remain steady. I can't ask you to give up a good opportunity for my sake. You sure about that? You've made impressive progress, but a month isn't long enough to prepare you for managing this place alone. Then I'll have to learn faster, or accept help from people willing to provide it. Jack studied her face in the dim porch light. Caleb Morrison's help comes with complications. He's a good man, but he's also unmarried and you're a single woman. People will talk. Let them talk. I need to survive the next 2 years. Reputation is a luxury I can't afford to worry about. Fair enough. But be careful, Clara. Montana's a place where reputations follow you forever. Make sure any choices you make are ones you can live with long term. That night, Clara lay awake thinking about choices and consequences and the increasingly complicated web of deception she was weaving. In 1 month, Jack would leave, and she'd be alone on a ranch she was supposed to be learning to manage. She could accept Caleb Morrison's help and risk exposure of her true identity, or she could attempt to manage alone and risk genuine failure. Either path led through dangerous territory. Either choice could destroy everything she was trying to build. But as Clara finally drifted towards sleep, she realized she wasn't just thinking about ranch management anymore. She was thinking about Caleb Morrison's hands, about the way he looked at her, like he was seeing more than she intended to show, about the offer of help that had sounded like something deeper than neighborly cooperation. Clara Whitmore had come to Montana to escape her past and build a new future. But she was beginning to suspect that both her past and her future might be more complicated than she'd ever imagined, and that some complications might be worth facing no matter how dangerous they proved to be. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Caleb's visit. Jack brought it from town along with supplies, his expression grim as he handed Clara the envelope bearing a return address she didn't recognize. Came through the territorial mail service, Jack said. Looks official. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she opened the envelope, afraid of what news might have followed her across the country. The letterhead read Blackwood Mining and Development Company in elaborate script. Miss Whitmore, the letter began. We understand you have recently inherited property in the Gallatin Valley. Our company is interested in purchasing ranch land for development purposes and would like to discuss terms that would be mutually beneficial. Please respond at your earliest convenience. Thomas Blackwood, President. Clara read the letter twice, her unease growing with each word. She'd never heard of Blackwood mining, and nothing in her uncle's papers had mentioned mining interests in the valley. What do you think? She asked Jack, handing him the letter. Jack's frown deepened as he read. Never heard of these people, and I've been in this valley 5 years, know most of the established businesses. Mining companies showing interest in ranch land sounds suspicious. Suspicious how? Mining claims require specific geological conditions. Your uncle's property has good grazing land and water rights, but I've never seen signs of mineral deposits worth commercial extraction. Jack folded the letter, handed it back to Clara. Could be legitimate, but it could also be speculators trying to acquire land cheap for reasons they're not sharing. Clara filed the letter away, but the feeling of unease lingered. She'd thought Montana would be far enough from her past to provide safety. Now strangers were showing interest in her property for unclear reasons. That afternoon brought another visitor, though this one was welcome. A woman rode into the ranch yard with the easy confidence of someone completely at home on horseback. She was perhaps 45, weathered but handsome, with steel-gray hair braided practically down her back. You must be Theodore's niece, the woman said as she dismounted. Margaret Sullivan. I run the ranch west of here. Clara had heard Jack mention the Sullivans. Successful operation, Margaret managing it alone since her husband's death several years earlier. One of the few women in the valley running her own place. Clara Whitmore, I'm pleased to meet you. Likewise. Margaret's handshake was firm, her gaze assessing but not unfriendly. Heard you were learning the business. How's it going? Slowly but steadily. Jack's been very patient with my education. Margaret nodded toward where Jack was working with horses in the corral. Jack Sullivan's my brother-in-law. Good man, excellent teacher. He tells me you're a quick study. I try to pay attention. Smart attitude. Ranching doesn't forgive carelessness. Margaret gestured toward the mountains where thunderheads were building. Storm coming tonight. Good time for indoor work. Mind if I impose on your hospitality while the weather passes? Clara welcomed the company. As afternoon turned to evening and the promised storm began with rumbles of distant thunder, she and Margaret sat in the kitchen drinking coffee and talking about everything from cattle breeding to the challenges facing women in Montana territory. It's not easy running a place alone, Margaret said, as rain began pattering against the windows. Men respect competence, but they don't always trust it in a woman. You have to prove yourself twice as capable as any man would. Have you found that difficult? Constantly, but it's also satisfying when you succeed despite their doubts. Margaret studied Clara over the rim of her coffee cup. Jack says you're picking up ranch work faster than he expected. That's unusual for someone with no background in agriculture. Clara's pulse quickened. Another person noticing her rapid progress, another potential exposure of her carefully maintained deception. Maybe I'm more suited to this life than I thought, she said carefully. Maybe, or maybe you have more background than you're admitting. Margaret's voice was casual, but her eyes were sharp. I grew up on a ranch, learned to ride before I could properly walk. I know what that kind of childhood looks like in a person. You've got the signs. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. What signs? The way you move around horses. No hesitation, no uncertainty. The way you assess property and livestock. Most city folks look at cattle and see an undifferentiated mass of animals. You look at them and see individuals. Clara was silent, unsure how much to admit or deny. Also, Margaret continued gently, you've got the hands of someone who's done hard physical work. Sewing might explain some calluses, but not the specific patterns I see on your palms. The storm was intensifying, outside wind howling around the house and rain drumming harder against the windows. Clara felt trapped by Margaret's perceptive observations and the weather that prevented easy escape from this conversation. Why does it matter? Clara asked finally. Because lies have a way of catching up with people in small communities. If you're hiding your background, you probably have good reasons. But Jack's leaving soon and you're going to need help from people who understand what you're really capable of. Lightning flashed bright enough to illuminate the kitchen through the windows, followed immediately by thunder that shook the walls. Clara made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. I grew up on a ranch in Ohio, she said quietly. My father raised cattle and horses. I learned everything I'm pretending to learn now before I was 15 years old. Margaret nodded slowly. What happened? Fire 7 years ago. We lost everything. The ranch, the livestock, my parents, my sister. Clara's voice was steady, but her hands trembled around her coffee cup. I barely escaped, spent the last 7 years in Boston trying to forget I'd ever been anything but a city seamstress. And now you're back to ranching because you had no other choice. Something like that. Clara met Margaret's eyes. Are you going to tell everyone that I've been lying? That depends. Are you planning to keep lying, or are you ready to be honest about who you are and what you can do? Another flash of lightning, another crash of thunder. The storm was directly overhead now, turning the night wild and violent. I don't know, Clara admitted. Being honest means facing things I've spent 7 years trying to avoid. Means risking people asking questions about what happened in Ohio. And keeping up the pretense means limiting yourself to what Clara the seamstress could reasonably accomplish, even when Clara the rancher's daughter could do better. It was a fair point. Clara had been holding back instinctively, allowing her true capabilities to show only gradually. But managing a ranch successfully might require more skill than she could safely display while maintaining her deception. There's something else, Clara said, making another dangerous decision. I received a letter today from something called Blackwood Mining and Development. They want to buy my property. Margaret's expression hardened. Tom Blackwood. Should have known he'd surface eventually. You know him. Know of him. He's been buying up property throughout the territory, usually at below-market prices from people facing financial difficulties. Claims to be developing mining operations, but I've never seen evidence of actual mining. What do you think he's really doing? Land speculation, most likely. Buying cheap, holding until values increase, then selling to railroads or other development interests. Margaret's voice was grim. He's particularly aggressive about targeting operations run by women or recent arrivals. People he thinks won't have the resources to fight back. Clara felt cold that had nothing to do with the storm raging outside. Fight back against what? Pressure tactics, legal challenges, sometimes worse. Margaret leaned forward, her expression serious. Clara, I need to tell you something. 3 ranches in this valley have been sold to Blackwood in the past 2 years. All of them had problems that made continuing operation difficult or impossible. Equipment failures, livestock deaths, water rights disputes. Nothing that could be proven as sabotage, but too much for coincidence. Are you saying he's forcing people to sell? I'm saying people who refuse his initial offers often find themselves facing unexpected challenges that make his offers look more reasonable. Lightning illuminated the kitchen again, followed by thunder so loud Clara felt it in her bones. The storm seemed to be directly overhead, as if nature itself was emphasizing the gravity of their conversation. What should I do? First, don't respond to his letter immediately. Appearing too eager or too resistant can both create problems. Second, document everything about your property and operation. If strange problems start developing, you'll want records to prove the timeline. Margaret paused, considering her words carefully. Third, start being honest about your capabilities. If Blackwood decides to target your operation, you'll need every advantage you can get. That includes the skills you're pretending not to have and the help from people who understand your real situation, including Caleb Morrison. Especially Caleb Morrison. His family has been in this valley longer than almost anyone else. He has influence and connections that could prove valuable. Margaret smiled slightly. Also, unless I'm very much mistaken, he's interested in more than just your legal affairs. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks again. What makes you say that? The way he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching. The way he found excuses to check on your progress more frequently than strictly necessary. The way he offered help that goes well beyond professional obligation. The storm was beginning to pass, thunder growing more distant and rain softening from violent drumming to steady patter. Clara felt as if the weather had externalized the emotional turbulence of the evening's revelations. Margaret, can I ask you something? Of course. How do you trust someone with secrets that could destroy everything you were trying to build? Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. You don't trust them with secrets. You trust them with truth. Secrets have power because they're hidden. Truth only has the power you give it. What if the truth is worse than the secret? Then you deal with the consequences of truth instead of living in fear of discovery. In my experience, most people are more understanding about honest mistakes than about deliberate deception. They talked until the storm passed, completely leaving behind the clean smell of rain-washed air and the kind of profound quiet that follows violent weather. Margaret declined Clara's offer to stay the night, mounting her horse, as moonlight began breaking through the dissipating clouds. Think about what I said, Margaret called as she prepared to ride home. About truth and trust and the fact that you don't have to face whatever's coming alone. Clara stood on the porch watching Margaret disappear into the night, her mind churning with possibilities and fears. The conversation had changed everything and nothing. She still faced the same choices about disclosure and deception, but now she understood the stakes more clearly. Someone named Thomas Blackwood was interested in her property for unknown reasons. Her carefully maintained pretense of inexperience was limiting her ability to respond to potential threats. And Caleb Morrison might be more ally than she dared to hope. The question was whether she had the courage to trust Margaret's advice about truth being preferable to secrecy. Clara went inside and sat at the kitchen table where her uncle's papers were stored. Among them, she found references to Thomas Blackwood dating back 2 years. Offers to purchase the property, each more insistent than the last. Her uncle had declined repeatedly, but the final letter suggested Blackwood wouldn't accept refusal indefinitely. Circumstances can change rapidly in frontier territories, the letter had concluded. I hope you'll reconsider my offer before such changes affect your operation's viability. Was that a threat, or merely a business observation? Clara filed the papers away and prepared for bed, but sleep proved elusive. Every sound seemed magnified in the post-storm quiet. Wind creaking through tree branches could be footsteps. Settling wood could be someone moving around the buildings. Cattle lowing in distant pastures could be signals between intruders. Finally, Clara rose and checked the locks on doors and windows, something she hadn't felt necessary to do since arriving in Montana. The feeling of being watched, of being targeted, had followed her west after all. The next morning brought Jack's departure preparations and Caleb Morrison's arrival, as if her conversation with Margaret had summoned exactly the help she needed. Heard there was quite a storm last night, Caleb said as he dismounted near the porch where Clara sat drinking coffee. Everyone all right? Fine, Margaret Sullivan visited, waited out the weather here. Clara studied his face for reactions to Margaret's name. She mentioned you might be willing to help with transition when Jack leaves. Margaret's a good judge of character. If she thinks you need help, you probably do. Caleb settled onto the porch step near Clara's chair, close enough for conversation, but respecting appropriate distance. Jack says he'll be leaving soon. End of the week. I'm grateful for the opportunity he's had, even though the timing isn't ideal for me. Never is ideal timing for losing good help. That's why neighbors need to support each other. Clara made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Caleb, there's something I need to tell you about my background and about why I might need more help than you realize. His expression sharpened with interest. I'm listening. Clara took a breath and began with Margaret's observation about her apparent familiarity with ranch work. She explained about growing up in Ohio, about the fire that destroyed her family's operation, about the years spent trying to forget she'd ever been anything but a city seamstress. Caleb listened without interruption, his expression remaining carefully neutral until she finished. So you've been pretending to learn things you already know, he said finally. Yes. I thought it would be safer, that people would be less likely to ask questions about my past if I seemed genuinely inexperienced. And now I think the pretense might be more dangerous than the truth. Clara showed him Blackwood's letter, explained Margaret's warnings about pressure tactics and suspicious circumstances affecting other ranchers. Caleb's expression darkened as he read the letter. Tom Blackwood. I should have expected he'd target your operation eventually. You know him? Know of him? He tried to buy our family ranch 3 years ago, became quite persistent when my mother declined his offer. We had some equipment problems that year, lost several head of cattle to predators, faced water rights challenges that hadn't existed before his interest. Margaret said similar things happened to others who refused his offers. They did. Nothing provable, but too coincidental for comfort. Caleb folded the letter, handed it back to Clara. If Blackwood's targeting your operation, you'll need every advantage you can get, including skills you've been hiding. Are you angry that I lied? Caleb was quiet for a moment, considering his words. I'm concerned about why you felt lying was necessary. I'm sympathetic to whatever drove you to such desperate measures. And I'm impressed by your competence, even if you've been understating it. Relief flooded through Clara's chest. So you'll still help? I'll help more effectively now that I understand what you're actually capable of. He met her eyes directly. Clara, I need you to understand something. If we're going to work together against whatever Blackwood has planned, I need complete honesty from you. No more pretending, no more holding back. Can you do that? It was a fair request, but also a terrifying one. Complete honesty would mean revealing not just her ranching background, but the specific details of what had happened in Ohio. The fire that might not have been accidental, the suspicions that had driven her west, the possibility that her past might endanger anyone who got too close to her. I can try, Clara said carefully, but complete honesty might include things you'd rather not know. Let me be the judge of that. Clara looked at his weathered face at eyes that seemed to see more than she was comfortable revealing, at the steady confidence of a man who'd spent his life dealing with hard truths and difficult choices. Maybe Margaret had been right about truth being preferable to secrecy. Maybe the risk of rejection was worth taking if it meant the possibility of genuine partnership. All right, Clara said quietly. Complete honesty, but not here, not where Jack might overhear. Some truths are dangerous even when they're shared with the right people. Tonight then, after Jack's settled in for the evening, we'll ride out to the boundary between our properties, talk where no one can overhear. Clara nodded, her heart already racing at the prospect of revealing everything she'd spent 7 years hiding. Tonight. Caleb stood, moved toward his horse, then paused. Clara, whatever you need to tell me, whatever happened in Ohio, it doesn't change the fact that you're building something worthwhile here. Don't let fear of the past destroy possibilities for the future. That afternoon, Clara worked alongside Jack on final preparations for his departure, but her mind was on the evening's planned conversation with Caleb. Complete honesty meant revealing not just her ranching experience, but the circumstances that had driven her west, the suspicions about the fire, the possibility that someone might still be looking for her. It meant trusting Caleb Morrison with truth that could endanger him if the wrong people discovered his knowledge. As sunset approached and Jack settled in for his final evening at the ranch, Clara prepared for a conversation that would either secure the partnership she needed or destroy any possibility of the future she was trying to build. Either way, by tomorrow morning, someone else would know exactly who Clara Whitmore really was and why she'd been running from her past for 7 years. The question was whether that someone could be trusted with knowledge that might prove as dangerous to him as it had always been to her. Clara met Caleb at the eastern boundary of her uncle's property as stars were emerging in the darkening sky. He'd brought a blanket and a thermos of coffee, practical preparations for what might prove to be a long conversation. They rode in silence to a grove of cottonwoods near the creek that separated their properties, dismounting where moonlight filtered through leaves and created dancing shadows on the ground. "This is far enough from both houses that no one will overhear," Caleb said as he spread the blanket near the water's edge. "And it's on both our properties, which seems appropriate for what we're discussing." Claire accepted the cup of coffee he poured, wrapping her hands around the warmth while she gathered courage for revelations that might change everything between them. "I don't know where to start," she said finally. "Start with Ohio. Tell me about the fire." Clara took a breath and began with her father's ranch successful operation that had supported their family comfortably for 15 years. She described growing up with her sister Rose, learning ranch work from childhood planning to eventually inherit and expand the family business. "We were good at it," Clara said, her voice growing distant with memory. "Rose was better with horses. I had a talent for reading cattle markets. Our father said we'd make a formidable team when we took over operations." "What changed?" "A man named William Turner started buying property in our area, claimed to be establishing a horse breeding operation, offered excellent prices for prime ranch land. Most neighbors sold and moved on to new territories." Clara paused, sipping coffee while she organized thoughts she'd spent 7 years trying not to think about clearly. "Our father refused to sell, said the land had been in our family too long to give up for any price. Turner became persistent, visited frequently, increased his offers, suggested that circumstances might change our minds if we waited too long. Threats, implied ones, nothing direct enough to involve law enforcement, but clear enough that we understood his interest wasn't entirely businesslike." Caleb was quiet, allowing her to continue at her own pace. Clara found his patience both comforting and unnerving. She'd expected questions, challenges, demands for proof of claims that must sound paranoid in the retelling. "The fire started in our barn on a night with no storms, no obvious ignition source. Spread faster than natural fire should, consume buildings that were well maintained and shouldn't have burned so completely." Clara's voice caught slightly. 7 years later, she could still smell the smoke, still hear the terrified screaming of trapped animals. "Rose and I were in the house when it started. Our parents were in town for supplies, weren't due back until morning. Rose ran to try to save the horses, while I attempted to organize water chains and firefighting equipment." "By yourself?" "The nearest neighbors were miles away. By the time help arrived, the barn was completely consumed and the fire was spreading to other buildings." Clara stopped, unable for a moment to continue. Even now, the memory of that night felt surreal, like something that had happened to someone else. "I lost sight of Rose in the smoke," Clara continued quietly. "Called for her, searched as long as I could before the heat and flames forced me back. Found her body the next morning in what remained of the horse barn." "I'm sorry," Caleb's voice was gentle, sincere. "Losing family is always devastating, but losing them that way—" The official investigation concluded the fire was accidental, spontaneous combustion in stored hay, which can happen under the right conditions. But Turner made another offer to purchase the property 3 days later, before the ashes had even cooled. That seems suspiciously convenient timing. It seemed more than suspicious to me. It seemed like confirmation that Turner had been responsible for destroying everything we'd built. Clara met Caleb's eyes across the space between them. "I couldn't prove it, couldn't convince anyone to investigate further, couldn't even convince our parents that Turner might have been involved." "What did you do?" "Sold what remained of the property to Turner for a fraction of its value. Took my share of the proceeds and fled to Boston, where I spent 7 years trying to forget I'd ever been anyone but a seamstress, with no family and no past worth remembering." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, processing everything Clara had revealed. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than judgmental. "And now you think this Thomas Blackwood might be employing similar tactics here in Montana?" "The pattern feels familiar. Persistent offers to purchase property, suggestions about changing circumstances, targeting operations run by women or people without established community connections. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warm evening. I may be paranoid, but I can't ignore the similarities. Paranoia isn't necessarily unreasonable if you've experienced what you're being paranoid about. Caleb moved closer on the blanket, close enough that Clara could feel warmth radiating from his body. Clara, I need to ask something that might be difficult to answer. All right. Do you think Turner might have followed you west? Is it possible that Blackwood is connected to whatever happened in Ohio? Clara had been dreading that question while simultaneously hoping someone would ask it. The fear had followed her across the country, the possibility that running hadn't been far enough to ensure safety. I don't know, she admitted. Turner would be in his 60s now, probably too old for frontier life. But he had business associates, people who worked for him who might have continued his interests. What did Turner look like? Tall, dark hair going gray, expensive clothes that didn't quite fit frontier life. Spoke with authority but wasn't from our area originally. Some people said he came from back east. Others thought he was from California. Caleb frowned. That could describe any number of business speculators, but there's something... What? I've met Thomas Blackwood once briefly at a territorial government function in Helena. Tall, well-dressed clearly, from somewhere with more civilization than Montana territory. Couldn't place his accent, but it wasn't local. Clara's heart began racing. Do you think they could be the same person? Turner is a common enough name to be easily changed. Blackwood could be an alias, or it could be a legitimate business partner who inherited Turner's interests. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Clara, if there's any possibility that your past has followed you here, we need to take precautions. What kind of precautions? Document everything. Keep records of all communications with Blackwood, all unusual incidents on your property, all interactions with people you don't recognize. If this escalates beyond business pressure, we'll need evidence to present to territorial authorities. Clara felt simultaneous relief and terror. Relief that someone believed her concerns were legitimate, terror that those concerns might prove justified. There's something else, she said quietly. Something I haven't told anyone. Caleb waited patiently for her to continue. The night of the fire, Rose said something before she ran to the barn. She said she'd seen someone watching our property earlier that day, someone who didn't belong in our area, a man with expensive clothes and a fancy horse. Did you tell the investigators? I tried. They said grief was making me imagine conspiracy where none existed. Said Rose might have been confused about what she'd seen, that traumatic situations can distort memory. But you believed her. Rose was the most observant person I've ever known. She could identify individual cattle from distances that would defeat most experienced ranchers. If she said someone was watching our property, someone was watching our property. Caleb absorbed this information, his expression growing increasingly serious. Clara, I think you need to consider the possibility that coming to Montana wasn't as random as you thought. Theodore's property was specifically left to you with conditions that required extended residence. What if that inheritance was designed to bring you west for reasons beyond Theodore's generosity? The suggestion sent cold through Clara's chest. You think my uncle's death might not have been natural? I think we need to investigate possibilities we might prefer to ignore. Caleb stood, began pacing near the creek's edge. That Odor died suddenly, no prolonged illness, no obvious cause. The property comes with debts that would force most inheritors to sell quickly. The inheritance conditions ensure you'd be here long enough for interested parties to locate you. But Theodore barely knew me. We met twice in my entire life. How do you know he barely knew you? How do you know he wasn't keeping track of your family's circumstances, aware of what happened in Ohio, deliberately creating an opportunity for you to escape whatever might still be pursuing you? Clara tried to process implications that transformed everything she'd understood about her situation. If her uncle had been protecting rather than burdening her, if the inheritance was rescue rather than responsibility, then her presence in Montana might not be the fresh start she'd hoped for. Caleb, what you're suggesting means that Turner or his associates have been tracking me for 7 years, that they somehow influenced my uncle's decisions about the inheritance, that they're patient enough to orchestrate elaborate schemes rather than simply taking what they want. It means they want something specific that requires your cooperation or your vulnerability. Something worth 7 years of planning and considerable financial investment. What could I possibly have that would justify such effort? Caleb was quiet for a moment, considering possibilities neither of them wanted to face. Information, he said finally. Proof of what happened in Ohio. Evidence that could expose Turner's methods or implicate him in criminal activity. Something Rose might have told you before she died, something you might have witnessed but not understood the significance of. Clara felt pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. Rose did say something else that night. After mentioning the stranger who'd been watching our property, she said she'd found something in the barn, something that didn't belong there. What kind of something? I don't know. She never had chance to show me before the fire started. Clara's heart was racing now, memory and possibility combining into terrifying understanding. What if Rose discovered evidence of Turner's plans? What if she was killed, not just to destroy our property, but to eliminate a witness? Then you might be the only person who knows she found anything, which makes you either a valuable asset or a dangerous liability, depending on what you might remember. Clara stood abruptly, moving to the creek's edge where moonlight turned water into flowing silver. The beauty of the night seemed obscene in contrast to the horror they were discussing. I can't remember what Rose might have found. I've tried for 7 years to piece together that night, but trauma and time have made memories unreliable. Trauma can also preserve memories that seem forgotten. Sometimes the right trigger can bring back details that consciousness couldn't access. Caleb moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel his presence as comfort rather than threat. Clara, I think we need to consider the possibility that someone is going to try to force those memories to surface. Through violence, through pressure, situations that replicate elements of that night in Ohio. Fire might be particularly effective for triggering traumatic recall. Clara felt terror course through her body. You think Blackwood might try to burn my property like Turner burned ours? I think if Blackwood and Turner are connected, fire would be both familiar methodology and psychologically effective pressure. Threatening to repeat your worst experience would be a powerful way to force cooperation. They stood in silence for several minutes, the weight of possibility settling over them like a physical presence. Clara had come west hoping to escape her past, but instead she might have walked directly into a continuation of the nightmare that had destroyed her family. What do we do? Clara asked finally. We prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. We document everything, establish communication with territorial authorities, create networks of support with neighbors who can provide assistance if needed. And if my worst fears are justified, if Turner or his associates have followed me here, if they're willing to destroy everything again to get whatever they think I know. Caleb turned to face her fully, his hands settling on her shoulders with gentle strength. Then we face it together. You're not alone this time, Clara. You don't have to carry this burden without support. Clara felt emotions she'd been suppressing for years, threatening to overwhelm her, carefully maintain control. The offer of partnership, of shared responsibility for fighting demons she'd been running from since Rose's death was more than she dared hope for. Why, she whispered, why would you take such risks for someone you barely know? Because everyone deserves the chance to stop running from their past and build something better. Because what happened to your family was wrong, and if there's opportunity to achieve justice, it should be taken. Caleb paused, his expression growing uncertain. And because I've come to care about you more than neighborly concern would justify. Clara's heart stopped for a moment, then resumed beating with painful intensity. Caleb, I know it's complicated. I know you have larger concerns than romantic entanglements. But if we're going to face whatever's coming, I want you to understand that my offer of help isn't just practical. It's personal. Clara reached up to cover his hands with hers, feeling calluses that spoke of honest work and steady strength. Thank you, she said simply, for believing me, for offering help, for caring. Does that mean you'll let me help completely without holding back information or trying to protect me from dangers I'm choosing to face? Clara looked at his weathered face in the moonlight and eyes that held steady determination and something deeper that made her pulse quicken. She thought about 7 years of carrying burdens alone, 7 years of looking over her shoulder, 7 years of half-truths and careful distances. Yes, she said quietly, complete partnership, complete honesty. whatever comes. Caleb pulled her closer, his arms coming around her with warmth that felt like safety she'd forgotten existed. For a moment, Clara allowed herself to lean into his strength to absorb comfort she hadn't experienced since Rose's death. Then practical concerns reasserted themselves, and she stepped back to meet his eyes directly. If we're doing this, we need to start immediately. Document my property's current condition, establish communication protocols, create contingency plans for various threat scenarios. Agreed. Also need to bring Margaret Sullivan into our planning. Her property would likely be targeted if someone wanted to isolate you from potential help. Clara nodded, her mind already racing through preparations that might mean the difference between survival and destruction. Caleb, there's one more thing. If my worst fears prove justified, if Turner's people have followed me here, and they're willing to use violence to get what they want, I won't let innocent people be hurt because of my problems. What does that mean? It means if staying here endangers you or Margaret or anyone else, I'll disappear again. I've done it before, I can do it again. No, Caleb's voice was firm, final. Running didn't solve the problem 7 years ago. It just postponed the confrontation. If these people have found you once, they'll find you again. Better to face them from a position of strength with people who care about the outcome. Clara wanted to argue, wanted to maintain the option of flight that had served as psychological safety net for 7 years. But Caleb's logic was sound, and the prospect of facing her demons with support rather than alone was too appealing to reject. All right, she said quietly, we stay and fight. We stay and fight, Caleb confirmed. They spent the next hour planning initial steps, documentation of property conditions and financial records, communication with territorial authorities about potential criminal activity, coordination with neighbors who could provide assistance or serve as witnesses if suspicious events began occurring. As they prepared to return to their respective homes, Caleb pulled Clara close once more. Clara, whatever happens in the coming days or weeks, I want you to remember something. You're not the terrified young woman who fled Ohio 7 years ago. You're a capable adult who's survived challenges that would have destroyed weaker people. Trust yourself as much as you're learning to trust others. Clara kissed him, then quick and soft and full of gratitude for understanding that went beyond words. When they separated, she felt steadier than she had since receiving Thomas Blackwood's letter. Tomorrow we start fighting back, she said. Tomorrow, Caleb agreed. Clara rode home through darkness that felt less threatening than it had for 7 years, her mind already cataloging tasks and preparations that would transform her from victim to active participant in whatever confrontation was coming. Behind her, she left the careful deceptions that had defined her existence since Rose's death. Ahead lay uncertainty, probable danger, and the possibility of finally achieving justice for her sister's memory. For the first time since arriving in Montana, Clara Whitmore felt like she was moving toward her future rather than running from her past. The feeling was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, like everything worthwhile she'd ever attempted. 3 days later, Clara's preparations proved their worth when smoke began rising from her neighbor's property to the south. She spotted the fire from her kitchen window while preparing breakfast, dark smoke billowing against morning sky in quantities that suggested more than accidental burning. Clara dropped what she was doing and ran for the barn where Dusty waited in his stall. The ride to the Sullivan Ranch took 20 minutes at full gallop, Clara pushing her horse harder than was wise over terrain that could kill them both with a single misstep. But the alternative, arriving too late to help, was unacceptable. Margaret's ranch showed signs of recent fire, but the flames were already dying down under control efforts by Margaret and her hands. The damage appeared confined to a storage building and sections of fence lines, significant but not devastating. Margaret, Clara called as she dismounted. Are you all right? Fine, though it was closer than I like. Margaret's face was streaked with soot, her clothes singed from fighting flames. Started about an hour ago, spread faster than natural fire should. We managed to contain it before it reached the main buildings. Clara felt cold certainty settle in her stomach. Any idea what started it? Found evidence of accelerant in the storage building. Someone wanted this fire to burn hot and fast. Margaret's expression was grim. This wasn't accident, Clara. This was message. Message about what happens to people who don't cooperate with certain business interests. I got a visit yesterday from someone claiming to represent Blackwood Mining. Made it clear that my continued resistance to selling would be Ill-advised. Clara's hands clenched into fists. The same tactics. Fire as intimidation, property damage, as pressure to sell below market value. Gets worse. After the fire started, I found this nailed to my porch post. Margaret handed Clara a piece of paper with crude lettering. This is what happens to stubborn women. Next time we won't be so careful about avoiding the house. Clara read the note twice, her anger building with each word. We're calling the territorial authorities. This is criminal intimidation, possibly attempted murder. Authorities are 3 days' ride from here, and they'll want proof beyond circumstantial evidence and an unsigned note. By the time they investigate, more damage could be done. Then we create proof. We document everything, we coordinate responses. We make it too dangerous for these people to continue their pressure tactics. Margaret studied Clara's face, seeing determination that hadn't been there during their earlier conversations. You've talked to Caleb about your past. Yes, he thinks the attacks here might be connected to what happened to my family in Ohio. That would explain the escalation. If Blackwood's people think you have information they need, they'll continue increasing pressure until you give them what they want, or, Margaret trailed off, or until they eliminate the problem permanently. Clara finished the thought that neither wanted to voice completely. Margaret, I think I should leave. Take the pressure off you and other neighbors by removing the target they're really interested in. Absolutely not. Running didn't solve your problem 7 years ago, and it won't solve it now. Besides, they've already targeted my property. Leaving won't necessarily end the threats against people who've supported you. Clara felt the truth of that assessment settle like a weight in her chest. By accepting help from Caleb and Margaret, she'd potentially expanded the circle of people at risk from her past. Then what do you suggest? Fight back, but smart, coordinated fighting, not just reactive defense. Margaret's voice carried the determination of someone who'd faced challenges that could have broken her. These people are using terrorism to force compliance. Time to show them that terrorism can work in both directions. What does that mean? It means we start making their operations more expensive than leaving us alone would be. It means we turn their tactics against them. It means we fight fire with fire. Clara felt a fierce satisfaction at the prospect of active resistance rather than passive victimhood. 7 years of running, 7 years of looking over her shoulder, 7 years of allowing fear to define her choices. Time to stop being afraid and start being angry instead. What do you need from me? Help planning a response that will convince Blackwood's people that continuing their pressure campaign will cost more than abandoning it. And information about what you might know that makes you valuable enough to justify their persistence. Clara spent the afternoon helping Margaret document fire damage while discussing possible connections between her past in Ohio and current threats in Montana. By evening, they developed preliminary plans for both defensive measures and offensive responses. The key is making their operations unpredictable and expensive, Margaret explained as they sat on her porch watching sunset paint the mountains. They succeed through intimidation because most people don't fight back effectively. Change that calculation and they'll move on to easier targets. What about evidence of criminal activity if we can prove they're using arson and intimidation? Evidence is good for long-term justice, but long-term justice won't help if they kill us before we can present it. Short-term survival requires immediate deterrence. Clara understood the distinction. Legal justice and practical survival operated on different timelines, required different strategies. Margaret, I need to ask something that might sound paranoid. Do you think my uncle's death was actually natural? Margaret was quiet for a long moment. I wondered about that timing myself. Theodore dies suddenly just when property values in this area are rising due to railroad speculation. His niece inherits with conditions that ensure extended residence, making her available for whatever pressure Blackwood wants to apply. So you think his death might have been murder? I think coincidences that convenient deserve investigation, but proving murder after the fact would be nearly impossible, especially if it was done with poisons that mimic natural illness. Clara felt rage building in her chest at the possibility that her uncle had been killed to facilitate whatever scheme was unfolding around her inheritance. If they killed Theodore to get access to me, if they're willing to burn property and threaten lives to force compliance, then they're not going to stop until they get what they want. or until we make continuing too dangerous to justify. Margaret met Clara's eyes. The question is whether you're ready to fight that kind of war. Clara thought about Rose dying in a burning barn, about 7 years of running from shadows, about Caleb's offer of partnership and Margaret's willingness to face danger for someone else's sake. Yes, she said quietly, I'm ready to fight. That night, Clara rode home through darkness that felt charged with possibility rather than threat. For the first time since receiving Blackwood's letter, she felt like she was moving toward confrontation rather than trying to avoid it. The feeling was terrifying and liberating simultaneously. Tomorrow would bring the next phase of whatever conflict was developing. Tomorrow she would coordinate with Caleb and Margaret to transform from targets into active participants in their own defense. Tonight, Clara Whitmore fell asleep planning strategy rather than escape routes and dreamed of fire that destroyed enemies instead of everything she loved. The war for her future was about to begin. 2 weeks later, Clara's preparations proved their worth when Thomas Blackwood himself arrived at her ranch. She spotted him from the kitchen window, tall, expensively dressed, riding a horse that had never known hard work. Even at a distance, something about his posture triggered memory that made Clara's breath catch. It could be him, 7 years older, dressed differently, but the bearing was familiar. The way he sat his horse like he owned everything he surveyed. Clara forced her hands steady as she checked the loaded rifle leaning against the wall near her door. Caleb and Margaret had insisted on weapons within easy reach, and now Clara was grateful for their paranoia. Blackwood dismounted at her porch with theatrical courtesy, removing his hat as he approached her door. Up close, Clara could see details that confirmed her worst suspicions. The same cold eyes she remembered from Ohio. The same arrogant smile that had made her father's hands clench into fists. William Turner had found her after 7 years. Miss Whitmore. His voice was carefully modulated, designed to project reasonable authority. I'm Thomas Blackwood from Blackwood Mining and Development. I believe you received my letter regarding purchase of your property. I received it. Clara remained in her doorway, not inviting him inside. I'm not interested in selling. I see, that's unfortunate. Perhaps you don't fully understand the challenges facing ranch operations in this territory. Weather market fluctuations, equipment, failures, accidents that can destroy years of work in a single day. The threat was clear despite the civilized language. Clara felt anger override fear, steadying her voice. I understand the challenges perfectly, Mr. Blackwood. Or should I call you Mr. Turner? His mask slipped for just a moment, revealing recognition and calculation beneath a polite facade. I'm afraid I don't understand your meaning, Miss Whitmore. Don't you? You understood it perfectly 7 years ago in Ohio when you destroyed my family's ranch and killed my sister to acquire property at below market prices. That's a very serious accusation. Do you have evidence to support such claims? Clara studied his face, seeing confirmation of everything she'd suspected. Turner had followed her west, had orchestrated her uncle's death, and inheritance had been patiently maneuvering her into position for whatever endgame he'd planned. I have 7 years of wondering what Rose found in our barn the night it burned. 7 years of remembering fragments that might become clear under the right circumstances. Turner's expression hardened. Memory can be unreliable, Miss Whitmore. Trauma often creates false recollections that seem real to the person experiencing them. Can it? Or can trauma preserve important details that conscious memory can't access without proper triggering? I suppose that would depend on what kind of triggering you're referring to. Clara smiled and saw Turner recognize that his psychological intimidation wasn't having the intended effect. The kind that involves federal investigators examining property records, interviewing survivors, analyzing patterns of suspicious business practices across multiple territories. Turner was quiet for a moment, reassessing his approach. When he spoke again, his voice carried open menace. Miss Whitmore, I think you're operating under some dangerous misunderstandings. This territory can be fatal for people who make enemies of the wrong individuals. Accidents happen frequently in remote areas. People disappear without explanation. Threats now, Mr. Turner. That's less subtle than your usual approach. Not threats, information. The same kind of information I provided to your uncle before his sudden illness convinced him that leaving property to you was his best option. Clara felt cold rage at the confirmation that her uncle had been murdered to facilitate Turner's scheme. What do you want? What I've always wanted. Information about what your sister discovered before her unfortunate death. Evidence that needs to be recovered or destroyed to protect certain business interests. And if I don't have that information, if Rose died before she could tell me what she'd found, then we'll need to explore methods of enhancing your memory. Fire can be remarkably effective for triggering traumatic recall. Clara's hand moved closer to the rifle near her door. You're threatening to burn my property to force psychological breakthrough. I'm suggesting that similar circumstances might produce similar results. People often remember things under stress that they can't access during normal mental states. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching riders. Caleb and Margaret appeared around the bend in Clara's access road, arriving together with the timing of people who'd been monitoring the situation. Turner's expression darkened as he recognized that Clara wasn't alone and undefended. Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Sullivan. Turner's voice carried forced civility. I wasn't aware Miss Whitmore had company coming. Neighbors look out for each other in this territory, Caleb said as he dismounted, especially when strangers with questionable intentions show up asking about property purchases. I'm a legitimate businessman pursuing legitimate opportunities. Are you Tom? Margaret's voice was skeptical, because legitimate businessmen don't usually require arson and intimidation to facilitate their transactions. Turner studied the three of them, calculating odds that had suddenly shifted against his favor. I see Miss Whitmore has been sharing certain theories about past events, theories that could be dangerous if they were to reach the wrong ears. The only danger, Caleb said quietly, is to people who use murder and terrorism to advance their business interests. Turner smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Mr. Morrison, I think you're underestimating the scope of what you're involving yourself in. This situation extends well beyond territorial jurisdictions. People in very distant places have interests that need to be protected. Are you threatening federal investigators? Claire asked. I'm noting that federal investigators can experience unfortunate accidents just like anyone else who interferes with important business operations. The mask was completely off now. Turner was revealing the extent of whatever organization was behind the pressure campaign, confident that knowing the scope of what they faced would convince Clara and her allies to surrender. Instead, it convinced Clara that fighting was the only option that didn't end with everyone she cared about dying. Mr. Turner, Clara said quietly, I think our conversation is finished. Miss Whitmore, I hope you'll reconsider your position before circumstances force more dramatic demonstrations of what happens to people who refuse reasonable cooperation. Turner remounted his horse with the same theatrical courtesy he'd displayed on arrival, but his eyes held promises of violence that made Clara's skin crawl. I'll give you 3 days to think about our discussion. After that, I'm afraid events will proceed regardless of your cooperation. He rode away at an unhurried pace, confident in his power to destroy everything Clara had built if she continued resisting his demands. Well, Margaret said as Turner disappeared beyond the first hill, that was illuminating. He killed my uncle to get me here, Clara said quietly, murdered Theodore to facilitate whatever he thinks I know about Rose's discovery. And he's planning to burn your property to trigger traumatic memories, Caleb added, just like he did 7 years ago in Ohio. Clara looked at the two people who'd chosen to stand with her against threats that could destroy them all. I'm going to give you one last chance to walk away from this, she said. Turner is not working alone, and he's willing to kill anyone who gets in his way. You don't owe me anything that justifies risking your lives. Actually, Caleb said, we do owe you something. We owe you the same support any neighbor deserves when facing criminal pressure. And we owe ourselves the satisfaction of making sure Turner doesn't succeed again. Besides, Margaret added, Turner's already threatened my property. Walking away won't guarantee safety, but fighting back might guarantee justice. Clara felt emotion tighten her throat. For 7 years, she'd carried the burden of Rose's death alone, convinced that involving others would only create more victims. Now she had allies willing to share the risk and the responsibility. All right, Clara said quietly. We have 3 days to prepare for whatever Turner has planned, 3 days to turn his advantages against him. What do you have in mind? Caleb asked. Clara smiled, and for the first time in 7 years, it was a smile that Rose would have recognized. The smile of someone ready to fight for what mattered instead of running from what scared her. I have in mind giving Mr. Turner exactly what he's asking for. We're going to stage a fire that triggers my traumatic memories and provides him with the information he wants. Except, Margaret said, understanding beginning to dawn in her expression, the information will be exactly what we want him to have instead of what he expects to get. Precisely, Turner thinks he's conducting this operation. Time to show him who's really in control. That evening, Clara Whitmore began planning the confrontation that would end 7 years of running and finally provide justice for her sister's memory. One way or another, the truth about what happened in Ohio was going to come to light, and William Turner was going to pay for every life he'd destroyed in service of his greed. The trap was set for tomorrow night. By the time the sun rose on the following day, either Clara would be free of the past that had haunted her for 7 years, or she would be dead alongside the people who'd chosen to help her fight. Either outcome was preferable to 7 more years of looking over her shoulder and letting fear define her choices. Clara fell asleep that night with Rose's voice in her memory, not screaming in terror, but laughing with fierce joy at the prospect of finally achieving the justice that had been delayed but never abandoned. Tomorrow, Turner would discover that Clara Whitmore was no longer the terrified young woman who'd fled Ohio 7 years ago. Tomorrow, he would meet the woman Rose's sacrifice had forged from grief and determination, and the refusal to let evil triumph through intimidation. Tomorrow, the war would end. 6 months later, Clara stood on her porch watching sunrise paint the Gallatin Valley gold and pink and impossible shades of hope. The mountains stood eternal and protective. The grassland stretched green and peaceful, and the cattle grazed contentedly across land that finally felt truly hers. William Turner was dead killed in the fire he'd started intending to terrorize Clara, but pushed from into submission. The trap they'd set had worked perfectly, too perfectly for Turner to escape the flames that consumed the abandoned building where he'd planned to torture information from Clara's memory. His associates had been arrested by federal investigators who'd found evidence of a conspiracy that stretched across multiple territories. Property theft, murder, or your intimidation, corruption of local officials. Turner's organization had been far larger than Clara had imagined, and its destruction had freed dozens of families from similar threats. Caleb emerged from the house carrying 2 cups of coffee, his hair still rumpled from sleep. Clara accepted her cup, gratefully leaning into his warmth as they watched their world wake up. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. Clara considered the question seriously. Did she regret the violence, the necessity of fighting fire with fire, the fact that justice had required becoming something harder than she'd ever wanted to be? "No," she said finally. "Rose would be proud that we fought back instead of letting him win through fear." "And what about us? Any regrets about choosing partnership over independence?" Clara smiled, thinking about the wedding that had taken place 3 months after Turner's death. Small ceremony, Margaret and Jack as witnesses, vows spoken on the same boundary between properties where she'd first told Caleb the complete truth about her past. "None whatsoever. Rose would love knowing I found someone willing to stand with me instead of trying to protect me by keeping me small." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the valley emerge from shadow into light. This land had tested Clara beyond anything she'd imagined possible, had forced her to become stronger and braver and more honest than she'd ever thought she could be. It had given her back herself, had given her Rose's memory without the burden of guilt, had given her love that was partnership rather than dependence. Most importantly, it had given her a future worth building instead of a past worth running from. "Clara," Caleb said quietly, "what do you say we expand the operation? Add some sheep to the cattle, maybe try our hand at horse breeding." Clara laughed, the sound carrying across the peaceful valley like a promise of joy yet to come. "I say we build something Rose would be proud of, something that lasts because it's grounded in truth instead of fear." "I love that plan." Clara Whitmore had inherited a ranch she'd never wanted and built a life she couldn't imagine losing, had faced her worst nightmares and discovered they couldn't destroy the woman she'd chosen to become, had learned that sometimes the only way to claim your future was to stop running from your past and fight for what mattered most. As the sun climbed higher over the Montana territory, Clara and Caleb planned improvements to land that would someday pass to children who would never know what it meant to be afraid of their own shadows. It was, Clara thought, exactly the legacy Rose would have chosen.